Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 9th, 1789, just weeks after the start of a new government with a freshly ratified U.S. Constitution under its belt, the first Congress is already embroiled in a debate about what to call the chief executive. You know, the guy who heads that executive branch. Is he the president, your excellency, your highness? Surely not your majesty, right? They were trying to get away from that kind of stuff. Well, let's go to that debate, which was actually about much more than just a title. It was about executive power and how to interpret the document of the Constitution itself. And our special guest for this episode is friend of the show, A.J. Jacobs, writer and podcaster. He has written books like Drop Dead Healthy and The Year of Living Biblically, in which he tries to live his life entirely according to the precepts of the Bible. And now he has done the same with that other great prescriptive text, the Constitution. The new book is The Year of Living Constitutionally. And yes, AJ wore a tri-corner hat. I've seen it. He wrote with a quill pen for much of this, alongside lots of other fascinating insight into what is actually in that document of ours, which not that many people have read. But AJ, you have actually read it, and he's wearing the tri-corner hat right now.
I just put it on. Yeah. I felt you were due the respect of the tri-corner hat.
And you wrote with a quill.
I did write with a quill, which I recommend.
Really?
I recommend. No dings and pings and internet to distract you. Yeah. I mean, the quill, you don't have to go that far, but just offline.
So before we get into this question of what to call the president, here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley, neither of whom are wearing tri-color corner hats, but, you know. We'll see.
Not for lack of desire, just for lack of hats, I think. Hello, Jody.
There.
Hello. Thank you for coming in, and happy to lend you one if you want.
Oh, good.
I'm going to hold you to that.
I think this question, how do you what do we call the president, is very instructive. And your book covers the writing of the Constitution and then, of course, the aftermath and the various ways in which we've interpreted and misinterpreted and fought over what that document says in the years since. And this question about the titles. I mean, it's the spring of 1789. Like the quill ink is hardly dry on this thing, and folks are already fighting about what it does and doesn't say.
Right, and it doesn't say what you should call the president. There's no. The Constitution is only 4 pages. They're big pages. Okay. I'll give you that. They're big pages. But there is so much to be filled in, and the first Congress did a huge amount in creating what we now know as the norms of our government. And one of the big issues was what to call the president, who was George Washington. Everyone knew it was going to be him right from the start. But what to call him? And as you said, Jody, it's not a frivolous issue because it really reflects how you feel about the executive office, how you feel about whether we should be veering towards monarchy, which is what pretty much the only thing people knew, or are you making this very this radical break and going more towards republicanism? So you had these two sides fighting, which basically broke down to the Federalists, who were much more pro-monarchy. John Adams, for instance, and they weren't. I shouldn't say pro-monarchy. They were pro-strong executive. Yeah. And then you had Democrat Republicans who were much more for a diffuse power and more state rights. And so, yeah, it was hilarious to see hilarious to us. I suppose it was not hilarious to them, but hilarious to see all the different pitches that Congress and the Senate considered, and you mentioned some of them. High mightiness, that could have been the president, could have been called high. Gosh. His benign highness. Benign doesn't describe a lot of presidents, I think. That would not be accurate.
Well, highness describes a few.
Yes.
Yeah. Supremacy, his excellency. It was a really heated debate. And in fact, the Senate which makes sense. The Senate being more of a, less democratic, they actually approved. They wanted to call it His Highness the President of the United States of America and protector of their liberties. That's what they approved, and Congress shot him down. And Congress said, "No, we just want the president." and the Senate eventually buckled. It was actually the first time the Senate and the House were at loggerheads.
That's wild. Nobody thought CEO. Let's just do CEO.
I like that idea. I think that's good. Exactly.
Well, and that very long title proposed by the Senate, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of these Democratic Republicans, called the title the most superlatively ridiculous thing I ever heard of. And I think
Which
that's
is a pretty superlatively ridiculous phrase in and of itself. So, yeah.
Good point.
It is. And it gets to, I think, as AJ is talking about, like something so much deeper, which is what do we imagine this person who is going to be running the country to be? And Democratic Republicans were very, very concerned that essentially how power works is that it always devolves back to monarchy or authoritarianism or like a single all-powerful ruler. And you have to do everything in your power, put in place every check and balance in order to prevent that from happening. And it's not just about like the structures that are laid down in the Constitution, but it's about the language itself. How do you construct a language around the presidency that takes away some of that pomp and circumstance and helps constrain the president to something lower than a god, which is what the monarchical language often suggests.
Yeah. Right. And I think the other side, the Federalist side, they were so worried that this government was so fragile. It was so new. You needed some sort of structure. You needed some authority. So John Adams was very much in the, let's go with His Highness. And people made fun of him. They called John Adams, his rotundity was an example of, which is ableist. I think you would call
fat shaming.
So fat shaming. And I liked, I found one newspaper that was so anti-title. They said that the only titles politicians should have is titles like Your Turbulence, Your Littleness, Most Factious, Most Stupid.
Oh, geez.
So that is some snark. But it is interesting because there was an as you had mentioned, there's two strains in early America. There's sort of the very much the democratic strain, but also the oligarchic strain, and both can be seen in the Constitution. But the anti-monarchy strain was very strong. They hated titles of all kinds. So you see in early America, King's College was renamed Columbia College. King's Street in several cities was now Congress Street. The King's Minuet Dance was called Congress Minuet Dance.
Oh.
So they really
downgrade.
And they have.
I know.
I know. Let's revive that.
You can have lunch at Burger Congress.
I like that idea. See, we have backslid. We have that. We seemed. My thinking is Disney needs to turn all of those princesses into Congress people.
Totally.
Let's get some democracy in the magic democracy, not Magic Kingdom.
All these little names, by the way, just makes me think of something we talked about recently on the show. A good amount later, but when John Tyler became president after William Henry Harrison died, his critics called him Your Accidency, which is an incredible put down. Maybe not
fantastic.
a little cleverer than Your Rotundity or what was it? You're Stupid.
Man, yeah. There's something about His Excellency, though. I just can't imagine us saying that in a current context, and maybe
because of what it signals or because it's just so awkward.
Because to me it feels so attached to royalty that, and if that's the one thing you're trying to get away from, and plus I think about George Washington, he never has any children, and so the idea of a bloodline or heirs that come after, that's what I think of when I think of royal families. For me, it's all about the heir, and so I just can't imagine that being the next most suitable title.
Interested in the forces shaping our world, the Council on Foreign Relations has you covered. For those who like to look ahead, dive into The World Next Week, hosted by Bob McMahon and Carla Ann Robbins.
We were not forecasting anything about Russian domestic upheaval, and yet that has been the story of the week.
These are scorpions going after each other in a bottle.
And for those who want to go beyond the headlines, join Jim Lindsay as he opens up the president's inbox.
What should U.S. policy do?
The approach towards China, it's enough to make me question bipartisanship.
And finally, join me, Gabrielle Sierra, on Why It Matters, as my guests and I bring some of the world's most compelling stories home to you.
Do you feel good about where we're heading with AI?
Maybe we need to invent a new word here, which kind of is a combination of frightened and excited. I'm
Frasighted.
So what are you waiting for?
For the world next week, the president's inbox.
And Why It Matters. We'll see you soon.
George Washington himself was, he was a complicated man. So in some senses, he was very comfortable with extreme power. But in other ways, he didn't want, he argued against His Highness and his supremacy. And he just wanted president. And this was interesting. I read there was one editorial that said that Washington in itself was enough. That name carried such weight that we should just call it Washington. And the implication was like future presidents would be called Washington. We would have Washington Obama, Washington Trump, which is sort of like Tsar. Right. Tsar is from Caesar. So there is precedent. But that would have been, I think, an odd choice. Luckily, Washington resisted the deification.
Well, I think
because it was amazing how some parts of society just deified him and portrayed him with a halo, literally, and odes to him. It's quite remarkable.
Deification is such a good word for that too. That idea that it like the spirit of Washington passes down in the position. It's like the king is dead, long live the king. It has that same feel of continuity through a person, which again does seem so contrary to that small r Republican spirit.
Right. And one thing we can talk about in the next episode is, though, I think they all saw Washington as so virtuous and so restrained in his quest for power that they did not put enough guardrails in because they did not see who would be coming in the future, people who had no self-restraint.
Yeah. AJ, are you saying norms aren't enough?
You said it, and I agree. I second that.
And AJ is going to be back on in a couple of weeks to talk about another story from this moment, this in the crafting of the Constitution, and really about kind of the makeup of the presidency and the executive itself.
For my book, I interviewed a lot of wonderful authors and historians, and a lot of what I learned about presidential titles comes from a historian named Kathleen Bartolone-Tuazan, who wrote a book called For Fear of an Elective King.
Cool.
So I just want to give her credit.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that book in the show notes for sure. But to wrap up, AJ, and maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the larger stuff you observed and learned and lived as you kind of spent time with this document. But obviously what we're talking about here is that the words that you choose really matter, right? And they signal something. That said, I also see in this, and you're a writer, and actually I've talked with you a lot about kind of like your approach to writing and kind of trying to find the simplest, most accessible language. And, how much of this debate and how much of the crafting of the Constitution in general was about kind of trying to push for something that was plain language, pushing away from all the sort of pomp and circumstance. You look at a phrase like, what was it? What was the most over-the-top thing that was proposed? His Highness, the President of the United States of America, and protector of their liberties or rights of the same. How much of that is a stance about who we are, and how much of it is just like, that's ridiculous language, we should find something a little plainer?
I definitely think what you said is true, that they were trying to find plain language that everyone in the United States could understand. And it was meant to be published, the Constitution was meant to be published in newspapers and read on street corners. And they And that's partly why it's so short.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't want to have to make the newspapers publish 500 pages. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of it had to do with this movement to make it more Republican in the small R sense, more Democratic in the small D sense. At the same time, as we mentioned, it's a complicated document, and it has elements of oligarchy and slavocracy. At the same time, it has elements of equality and this big bang of democracy, as one of my constitutional advisors said. So it is. It's a lot about trying to make the Constitution live up to the more democratic side, as opposed to focusing on the oligarchic side. And my point in doing the book was, I actually tried to understand it by I like to walk the walk, talk the talk, wear the tricorn hat, carry the musket, eat the boiled mutton, read the Cicero, just
quartered troops, right?
Not the mutton.
Yes, I did.
Did you?
I did. I quartered one troop, just one guy. That's my Third Amendment right. I wrote with a quill instead of using social media, and I passed it around. And it was fascinating because historians, and I am not a professional historian, but I love history, and I walked the walk of a historian, but they say the past is another country. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that. So part of my goal to get into the heads of these people from the founding generation, it's never going to happen. One historian told me it's like trying to get inside the head of an oyster. You know, you cannot, it's so different. But I still think it's a worthwhile endeavor to try, because it makes you realize how different the world was. And I think it makes you realize how important it is to evolve the meaning of the Constitution and have more of this pragmatic approach instead of being totally focused on what was the original meaning, because it was a very different society.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Well, I said you're going to be back. I have one last question for you, which I think is a big, swirling, probably not very easy to answer question. But I'm curious because I feel like half the time we talk about the Constitution on this show, we point out how problematic the words in it are. And then half the time we talk about the Constitution on this show, we point out how problematic it is that they didn't address a certain thing, right? And so what we're talking about here is the fact that they never got around to addressing kind of this question of what do you call the president? You know, they never really got around to addressing, like, what do you do when the president dies, right? So very, very broad sweep question. But AJ, do you feel like the words in the Constitution or the words left out of the Constitution have caused more problems over the years?
How about both? Okay. Can I take both? It is one of the shortest constitutions. For my book, I interviewed a scholar of all the world's constitutions, and ours is one of the shortest, and it's a double-edged sword. In one sense, it means it has flexibility because words like equal protection can evolve. On the other hand, it leaves out so many rights that you can have people argue, oh, well, that's not a right because it's not in the Constitution. Even though James Madison was worried about this very topic and put the Ninth Amendment, which says just because we don't enumerate a right doesn't mean it's not a right. So it's more up to us. I don't like to finger point back then because they were flawed individuals, and we can't change it, what they did, but we can change how we interpret it, how we implement it. We can change. It would be nice if we could change more of the Constitution. They made it too hard to amend the Constitution. I don't think they meant to make it that hard. They didn't see the two-party system coming. So we are kind of stuck with the words, but we can change how we use the Constitution. It's a tool like any other.
All right. Well, AJ Jacobs, as we said, you'll be back in a few weeks to talk about some other stuff from your book, but the book is out. It's called The Year of Living Constitutionally, another great AJ Jacobs book. And of course, we should point out that AJ is my partner in the Puzzler podcast, which people have heard about, and you should go listen to that too. So AJ's got a lot of cool things going on. But thank you so much for doing this. This is really fascinating.
Well, thank you. And as you know, history is a puzzle. So thank you three for helping me to try to figure out that puzzle.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Her Excellency, Kelly Carter Jackson.
Thank you.
Radiotopia.